I don't want to be in the way here. So thank you very much. And again, I'll be talking about the first Black Baptist churches in Canada between 1750 and 1950. And what I'll attempt to do is go from province to province. I'm going to start from west and go across to the east. And when I first started to research this project, it's a book right now. There are 5 elements, and I'll go over the 5 elements in just a second. The first element is, how did people of African descent get to each individual province in order to form a Black community and create the Baptist church? And the Canadian, in the Canadian worldview, it's ostensibly everyone that's Black or of African descent came up into each province via the Underground Railroad. Now, that's true, but it's certainly not the entire story. It's fundamental to note that, or important to note that the foundations for the African Canadian community rests on the Atlantic slave trade via the colony of New France. And so immigration to that province would then build the number of African Canadians and allow for the Black community to be created. And obviously the Black church would come out of that. So people of African descent, how they got to each individual province, the founding of the Black church and Black community, sort of one and the same. You'll see some commonalities here. The founding of the Black church and Black community, the Black church in particular, the common thread, through line that you'll see is that the population increases, Blacks are segregated in the white church or pushed out of the white church, which then gives them the impetus to create their own church. The pastor, another through line, like commonality, the pastor is often in the Baptist denomination, often unordained, charismatic, and a great orator. The African American and African Canadian churches demand of their pastor the ability to evoke an emotional response in each sermon. So the fourth element will be the church architecture. And scholars like Miles and Nelson and Bates tell us that the architecture of the church is a reflection of the Black community itself. So the church, which are usually, when they're created by the Black community, they are what are called auditory vernacular churches. And most of the churches that are created, and we'll talk about, a lot of them have become Canadian historic sites, whether they're in Alberta or Saskatchewan or in Nova Scotia. So the church is actually built for the comfort of the congregants, and the pews are comfortable, and the sight lines are, I mean, if you're a sports fan, it's a great stadium. You can see the pastor and hear the pastor no matter where you're sitting. Why? Because they're ex-slaves. They are illiterate for most part. And so they don't have money to buy hymnals. So you need to be able to see and hear the pastor. And it has to be a comfortable place. And it reflects the Black community because it says at one time you were possessions, but now you have a possession that you would have created using your own hands. The bricks would be made by the congregants to use to build the church. And so you now have a possession which then reinforces one's personhood. So that the church itself is a reflection of the Black community. And then the Black experience in that province usually came out of the church, whether it was Methodist or Baptist. And we'll talk about that when we can. So that's sort of the through line through what we're going to speak about. And that's an auditory vernacular church. That's Amherstburg, First Baptist Church. And it's a historic site, and that's the inside of the auditory vernacular church. Now, they weren't always built, depending on what province. And we'll start in BC. In California, during the gold rush, free Blacks were trying to access financial security through the gold rush, just like whites were. And the whites would take their Black slaves with them. But California was a slave-free state, which sounds great at the onset, but in reality, what they wanted was a white state. They didn't want any Blacks in the state. So when you got there as a slave, they changed you from a slave to white to an indentured servant. which I'm sure made absolute, the slave really didn't, thanks for changing my name, but everything's still the same. But they also tried to pass a bill that not only didn't allow blacks into the state, but removed any blacks that were currently in the state. So now you are a black in San Francisco and you're not poor, destitute. And I should have added that when I talked about the Underground Railroad, because that's the sort of the Canadian worldview that all blacks came through the Underground Railroad, poor, destitute. That's, again, not the whole story. These are people of means in San Francisco. You couple that with the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, and you, as black in San Francisco, are starting to feel like an alien in your own country. And so you're looking for some sort of amelioration of your predicament. Well, in walks Douglas. He is the governor of Vancouver Island. And in any definition of black in America, he's actually black because his mom's Creole. So he has one drop of black blood, which makes him black, but he passes as white and he's the governor of Victoria. He talks to the blacks in San Francisco and says, hey, come on up here. You'll be British citizens. You'll have full citizenship. You won't be segregated. You'll have the capacity to live free and prosper. And so they did. And they came up and they bought land and they were, again, affluent. The cab company in Victoria was actually run by a black man. And so these aren't poor, destitute, fugitive slaves. These are blacks of means that come up and actually prosper in Victoria. The Black Baptist Church isn't created. I'm jumping to the end. What initially happens is the First Baptist Church of Victoria is an integrated church, half black, half white. But on its onset, because of financial concerns and sort of a carousel of pastors, it's on shaky ground. And so an arbiter comes up from the United States and says, your problem is you've got blacks and whites. That doesn't work. So the arbiter gives the church to the white congregants, gives the blacks a small stipend to start their own church, which isn't enough. And the church falters and simply ceases to be. And a Black Baptist church is never, ever seen or established in British Columbia. For a great chapter that talks about that event, that first Victoria in BC, on Vancouver Island, you can see our new book, The Black Baptist Experience. There's a chapter on it that written by Taylor Murray. It's excellent and gives you sort of the whole breakdown from the perspective of the Black Baptist congregants. So we'll jump over to the prairies and we'll look at Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. So in 1905, Alberta and Saskatchewan became provinces. Manitoba was one in 1870. What occurs is that they take the indigenous people off their land, which you'll see is an irony when we get to it. So they remove the indigenous people from the prairie lands. The prairies are incredibly fertile land. And so what the Canadian government sees happening is that there will be a flood of Anglo-Canadian settlers that, and I quote, will possess the best attributes of British society. And so they because of this fertile soil and the land is free or cheap, will get a flood of immigrants. Well, that doesn't happen. So they develop programs to entice settlers to come up to the prairies. And one of these programs is advertising in American newspapers, and particularly in what was then the territory of Oklahoma. It hadn't become a province. Now, blacks live in Oklahoma, and because it's not a state, it's not subject to Jim Crow laws. So blacks have the vote, they buy land, they prosper there. Then all of a sudden Oklahoma becomes a state, and that's all removed. And so they're looking just like their brethren in BC, they're looking for an amelioration of their situation now. So when Canada sends down these ads in the paper, they probably did an error. They also advertised in the Black newspapers. So you had Blacks coming up from Oklahoma. They came from Texas and Kansas, but mostly from Oklahoma. And so they came up and are going all the way down to our prime minister saying, you know, that the Black problem in the United States is not a Canadian problem. So they didn't want Blacks. So they then developed programs to prevent them from crossing the border. And one of these programs is sending agents down to the Black churches and saying, don't come up here, you'll freeze to death or starve to death in your first year. Yeah. Or at the border, they had medical examinations. And if you didn't look healthy, they could turn you away. They actually tried to bribe the medical officers at the border to give them more money for how many Blacks they sent back. The medical officers didn't take the bribe, but they did try that. And they also checked for their finance, if you had enough money. Well, these were people that were doing very well in Oklahoma until the laws were changed. So they didn't have that problem, but it did work. And maybe 1,000 Blacks actually made it because they were scared off. And they established, that is Shiloh Baptist in Saskatchewan. And there was a Shiloh Baptist in Alberta, same name. And in Manitoba, it was named after Joseph Hill, and I'll talk about him in a second. He's fascinating. This is an auditory vernacular church, and it's a historic site. The other two churches changed locations so often, and the Blacks never got to build their own church. So you never got that architecture reflecting the Black community. You did, however, in Saskatchewan. Now, back to Oklahoma. At the time, before it became a state, and it was a territory, it had what are called the 5 civilized tribes. And they're called civilized because they adopted some Western, white Western culture. And part of that is they had Black slaves themselves. So when you had emancipation in the United States, 3 of the tribes dealt with it differently than 2 of the other tribes. The Seminole and the Creek, they assimilated their Black slaves, they intermarried. And why is this important? Because when there was an emancipation and when they did give land to the indigenous peoples there. So after emancipation, Blacks were supposed to get 40 acres and a mule. They didn't get that, but the indigenous did get 160 acres. And on those 160 acres, a lot of them had oil underneath. There's a great movie, got a long title. It's
Killers of the Flower Moon.
There you go. You can never remember that. It talks about that. And so 1/3 of the Blacks coming up from Oklahoma to the prairies, the Canadian prairies, 1/3 of them were actually African Indigenous. And so there's a bizarre irony that you kick the Indigenous off their land and 1/3 of the people coming up their land see themselves as Indigenous and have quite a bit of money because they were gifted this 160 acres of land, and some of which had oil on it. That takes us to Ontario. And Ontario obviously grew its population through mostly the Underground Railroad, mostly. I always have to throw in here, at one point, the Underground Railroad went north to south, not south to north, because the only free area was the northern states in the United States. But at this time, the immigration was the other way, and we get the Underground Railroad, and its impetus is the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. It makes African Americans basically aliens in their own country. They're coming up. You have to understand that there are Black fugitive slaves, but there are lots of northern Blacks of means that have never been slaves. And so one of the fallacies is that all the Blacks coming in the Underground Railroad, or even they didn't all use the Underground Railroad. There's no internet back then, so how would you even know? Right, so probably about 2/3 of the people coming up to Ontario were never slaves. They were just trying to maintain their freedom during the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. And what happened is a lot of Black Baptist churches sprung up. William Winks, arguably could be the first Black Baptist church in Canada, in Colchester. I'm still researching that because there's one in New Brunswick I'm going to talk about. Anthony Binga's Senior is Amherstburg. Washington Christian is Toronto and Hamilton and St. Catharines, 5 minutes. Okay, I'm going to start moving a little quicker. And they created the Amherstburg Baptist Association, which is a collection of Black Baptist churches in Ontario. Going to move quickly to Nova Scotia. It had differing sources of immigration. You get the Black New England planters, you get the Black loyalists, the Black refugees, and you get the slaves of the Black loyalists. Again, lots of Black Baptist churches spring up, some huge names. David George, Richard Preston, which is there is a presentation on him today. He's basically the father of the Black Baptists in Nova Scotia. J.R. Johnson, Kenny, and they create the African United Baptist Association, which again is an amalgamation of Black Baptist churches. Kenny and J.R. Johnson, they also create the Colored Hockey League in Nova Scotia, which is in existence probably about 20 years prior to the Negro Baseball League, and is governed by the Black Baptist churches. And that takes us down to the last three provinces that we'll talk about today, and that's Quebec, PEI, and New Brunswick. So the how. PEI is, the reason why I group these because of their similarities and stark differences. PEI and Quebec really never get a Black Baptist community. PEI because it's, when there was the Black loyalists, only white loyalists went to PEI and they brought their slaves. And so when they were freed there wasn't enough of them to create a Black Baptist community. And so it never happened. And then they were assimilated in a place called the Bog. And the Bog was basically all the Blacks, all the poor whites, and they intermarried. And over the years, they intermarried and essentially assimilated all the Blacks. And you can't really find a Black Baptist community in PEI. So when I'm doing my research, it's someone is a white woman talking about her ancestors that were Black. That's how much the assimilation of PEIs have. In Quebec, it just never got that big of immigration of Blacks, whether it was loyalists or Underground Railroad. It just didn't. And the few that were there, that were freed during Emancipation Day, left for other provinces that did have a Black community. They didn't establish their Black community until the 1920s when the trains, Canadian trains, American trains met, and they wanted porters, and the porters were all Black. So the CP Rail went down to what are called now historically Black colleges, got those students in the summer, made them porters, and brought them up to Quebec and created the region that's today called Little Burgundy. And there they actually, the Black Baptist Church didn't develop there. It was a Union Congregationalist church, 2 minutes. And the Union Congregationalist church, that Black church was the only Black church to merge with the United movement, the United Church in Canada, and it became Union United. And it fought a great battle in the Supreme Court. I'm going to try to end that with this. New Brunswick, same as Nova Scotia in terms of Black immigration. It created a Black community in 1806, could be the oldest Black community in Canada. Again, I'm researching that, and it's a great example of erasure and or they just forgot the Black history, in that they had two Black Baptist churches across the street from one another, which begs a lot of questions. Why do you have two? Why are they across the street? So these are all these questions that I'm trying to get answers to in my research. Lastly, the laws. And so for all three, New Brunswick didn't allow Blacks into the capital city without a note. PEI, only province to ensconce slavery into law. It barely had any slaves, but it did. And Quebec, the Reverend Esty, the last thing I'll talk about, he fought with a man named Christie, who loved the Montreal Canadiens. We'll probably be out of the playoffs soon. And he couldn't get a beer there at the York Tavern, which was in the Forum. And so he fought it all the way to the Canadian Supreme Court, because he was black, he wasn't allowed to drink beer in the York Tavern. And the Supreme Court stated that discrimination is not unlawful or immoral. And it sort of set the tone for race relations in Canada from that point on. That was 1936. Thank you. I got through it all.